Plahowya, my name is Sally. I'm a ranger here at Lewis and Clark National Historical Park on the homeland of the Clatsop and Chinook. Welcome to this virtual In Their Footsteps guest speaker event, sponsored by the Lewis and Clark National Park Association, the park's nonprofit partner, supporting educational opportunities like this and operating the impressive Fort Clatsop Bookstore in the Visitor Center and at fortclatsopbookstore.com. Today's speaker, David Nicandri, directed the Washington State Historical Society for 24 years. He has studied and written about Captain James Cook, as well as the Lewis and Clark expedition for nearly 2 decades, and has a keen interest in the exploration phase of the Pacific Northwest. He has written several books, including 2 that are available in the Fort Clatsop Bookstore. Lewis and Clark Reframed, Examining Ties to Cook, Vancouver, and Mackenzie, as well as River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia. He was a speaker for our In Their Footsteps last spring and volunteered to share a second program with us today. We're recording this program on October 7th, 2021, and David Nicandri will answer questions live in the chat when this is broadcast on Facebook Premiere October 17th. In a moment, Dave will discuss how the Northwest Passage was not a single geographic concept, but rather a series of them, and how this helps us better understand several expeditions. Please type your questions and comments into the chat box. We'll be watching for those and plan to answer in the chat during the talk. Now it's time for Captain Cook, Lewis and Clark, and the Evolution of the Northwest Passage with David Nicandri.
Thank you very much, Sally, and thank you to Catherine Allery and the entire team at the Lewis and Clark National Historic Park for this invitation. I appreciate the opportunity to deliver these remarks. So if my talk had a subtitle, it would be A Story in 4 Maps. The Northwest Passage is a complicated subject. It was one of the 3 great geographic quests of the Enlightenment. So let me just talk briefly about the Enlightenment. It was a pivotal period in the history of Western civilization. Chronologically, historians generally frame it as running between 1640 and 1789. It had 2 major divisions. One was kind of moral and philosophical. John Locke and Thomas Jefferson would be 2 important figures in that vein. A concentration today, however, is going to be on the scientific side of the Enlightenment, where some of the pivotal figures in astronomy and physics, for example, would have been Isaac Newton. In botany, it would have been Linnaeus. And in geography, the pivotal figure was Captain James Cook. So that's the period of the Enlightenment, some of the major figures. Cook had many emulators. 2 of the more important ones, central to the mission of the park, of course, were Lewis and Clark, and I'll be referring to them a little bit later on. So I refer to the Northwest Passage as one of the 3 great geographic quests of the Enlightenment. One might ask, what were the other 2? One was the notion of terra australis incognita, the unknown southern continent. Now, this concept imagined that below the equator in the southern hemisphere, there had to be a mass of land as big as Eurasia and North America are above the equator. Otherwise, the Earth would wobble on its axis because it was unbalanced. So the terra australis incognita, which people they thought they had seen hints of, various outcroppings of land here and there, those were merely the promontories or projections of a larger southern continent in the mid to high southern latitudes, most people thought between Africa and South America, although some also put it in the southern Atlantic Ocean. That was one quest. The quest for longitude was another one. Establishing one's latitude at sea was relatively easy to do. One merely had to measure the angle of the sun, and from that you could tell if you were at 10 degrees north or 40 degrees north or 70 degrees north. Longitude was a much more complicated proposition that involved calculating the appearance of various moons around Jupiter, or the juxtaposition of the moon with several stars. Very complicated topic. I'm not going to go any deeper into that, other than to say that the quest for longitude was largely solved by the developing of a timepiece that one could almost hold in their hand that indicated the time in Greenwich, the prime meridian, and if you could see what time it was in Greenwich, compare it with noon, your local time, you just that would yield how many degrees of latitude, longitude one was west or east of Greenwich. That was the second great quest. The third, of course, is the topic of today's presentation, the Northwest Passage. And interestingly enough, Captain Cook is associated with all three of these quests. That's why, to my reckoning, he is the emblematic figure of Enlightenment era geography. Now, the key notion that was highlighted at the introduction by Sally is that there was not one Northwest Passage, but actually several. And indeed, the Northwest Passage is a geographic concept that even to this day is undergoing a form of evolution. And I will come back to that point near the end of my talk. By my count, there have been 5 versions of the Northwest Passage. The 5th and current one is actually a reversion to the original one, which I will highlight in my remarks as we cycle through the 4 key maps that help tell this story. So to talk about the origin of the Northwest Passage as a geographic concept, everyone tuning in who studies geography would be familiar with the story of Christopher Columbus, who, it's important to remember, the point of his voyage was to find a shortcut from Western Europe to the East Indies and China, where there were valuable materials and spices and so forth, as opposed to, and sailing west across the Atlantic to get there, as opposed to the long roundabout route south of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and then reaching the East Indies or China that way. Columbus, of course, stumbled into what we now know as the New World, the Western Hemisphere. He referred to the inhabitants, famously or infamously, depending upon how you look at it, as Indians, because he thought he had reached the East Indies. That is the origin of that term. Now, in the aftermath of Columbus, other people, Amerigo Vespucci was perhaps the most famous, Jacques Cartier, other Spanish explorers, they began to create more definition to the terrestrial holdings of the Western Hemisphere. Well, we would know, of course, as North and South America. But it wasn't too long, wasn't even a century after Columbus in 1492, before there was the early absorption that Columbus had actually discovered, as a word, the problematic phrase, of course, but had encountered a whole half a hemisphere of land. But the preceding quest, that is to say, a means of getting from Western Europe to China or the East Indies, that quest did not go away. So after the original scoping out of the dimension of North and South America, the quest for that shortcut to Asia and the East Indies resumed as early as the 1570s, well before all of North and South America had been comprehended geographically. The preceding quest started up again. This was a quest that all the naval and imperial powers of Western Europe engaged in. Portugal, Spain, France, principally Great Britain, because they were best positioned at the northwest corner of northwest Europe to find a passage around or through this newfound land that Columbus, Cartier, the Spanish explorers had begun to inscribe on the world's maps. That's why it's called the Northwest Passage. It's a means of traveling northwest of Europe through or around North America to the original destination of China and the East Indies. All of the early efforts, primarily by Englishmen, their names dot all of the northern half of North America. Davis, Baffin, Frobisher, most famously Hudson. Whatever discoveries they made about North America was inadvertent. The goal was to get through North America to Columbus's original destination. Now, by definition, these approaches are all from the Atlantic side of North America. It wasn't long, however, before someone, England again, decided, because there was great difficulty finding such a passage, let's try it from the west. That is to say, is there a way of finding the Northwest Passage by approaching it in a northeasterly direction from the Pacific Basin as opposed from the Atlantic? The first attempt in that direction was made by Francis Drake in 1578. Better known as a pirate for his raiding of Spanish shipping. This was in the Elizabethan era. Elizabeth I, I guess I should quickly add, since Elizabeth II is the queen today. And as I've written elsewhere, I have the suspicion that the legend of Juan de Fuca, who was a Spanish navigator, a real figure historically, but whose voyage of 1792 was thought to have discovered the Strait of Juan de Fuca as we know it today, off of the northwest corner of the modern state of Washington. I've developed a theory with my friend Robin Inglis that Juan de Fuca learned of Drake's voyage to these latitudes. Drake probably got as far as 50 degrees north before he gave up the quest for looking for the passage from the Pacific side and sailed across the Pacific and returned to England with all that gold and silver and other precious materials that he had raided from Spanish shipping. But among other things, I think Drake seeded the legend of Juan de Fuca's supposed discovery of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So as the 16th century came to a close and through the balance of the 17th, there's a famous saying, nature abhors a vacuum, and the same is true in cartography. So because there were specific gaps in geographic knowledge about North America and where a passage through or around it may lay, speculative geographers began to fill that vacuum with a whole catalog of very fanciful notions about whether a passage existed at all, because a lot of the maps envisioned that North America at its top was actually connected to Eurasia. And early on, the idea of a Strait of Anian, A-N-I-A-N, that concept floated up and down the west coast of North America. It was kind of an analogy to the Straits of Magellan, because there was a strait through the southern tip of South America. It was imagined there might be a strait through the top of North America. Symmetrical notions in geography was a very common facet of thought at this point in time. But the first conclusive findings about the Northwest Passage actually came from a surprising quarter, and that was Russia, very much a latecomer to this quest in the 1740s. And so let's now turn to our first map, and we'll continue the story from this point through these next several cartographic images. Now, our first map that you see here on the screen was published in 1753 by a compiler of maps by the name of Leonard Euler, E-U-L-E-R. The map is actually based on a 1752 map by one Philippe Buache, B-U-A-C-H-E. And Buache was the first cartographer to incorporate in his image findings from Vitus Bering's voyages on behalf of Russia. Bering was a Dane, but sailing on behalf of Russia from Kamchatka to North America. This was the era Peter the Great was the Tsar. As Tsar, was very eager to have his empire catch up with the ferment, the intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment. And so he was reliant on skills and abilities since they were not native to his country at that time. So his navigator was a Dane. Buache and other French cartographers helped develop the discovery agenda for this voyage. And in time, of course, Russia would develop its own homegrown talent. But so you have this international combination of talent. The Russians are looking are engaging in their own discovery at the far eastern end of their terrain, Siberia, or the Russia Far East as it's known. And when Buache published his map, it was the first to incorporate some of the findings that Euler copied in the map you see here. Now let's look at this map carefully, paying attention principally to what you see on the right half of the screen. To the left, you will see a reasonably well-defined definition of the Asian landmass. But what this map also shows definitively is that there's a separation, and this was something that Bering and other Russian navigators were able to determine during the course of the late 16th and early 17th and 18th century, was that Asia and North America, in fact, were not one contiguous landmass. There was a separation, and it takes the form of what we know today very sensibly as Bering Strait. So this map shows just to the left or underneath the cartouche, which is the label in the upper center, shows the separation between Asia and North America. But I want to call your attention in particular in the middle right of the image. And now you can see, you'll recognize the form of North America, Florida, the Atlantic coastline. You'll also see an approximate definition of the Great Lakes, Hudson Bay, but almost in the center of the image. And in fact, I think this was the point of Buache and Euler in his copying of it. You'll see a large open space denoted as the Mer de l'Ouest, the Western Ocean. Going back to the notion I typified earlier about how the world's geography was symmetrical, since there was a large opening of salt water off the Atlantic in the form of Hudson Bay, French cartographers, and this was a favorite notion of theirs, developed the theory that if there was an opening like that off to the Atlantic, there was of similar size and dimension and location off at the Atlantic. And you see that here as the concept of the Mer de l'Ouest. To the north of this big bay, big inlet, and it may be difficult to see on your screen, but there was a network of rivers and lakes also connecting to the Atlantic side of Canada that was the imagined route of the purely mythical voyage of Admiral Dafont. Much like unlike Fuca, who was a real person but conducted an imaginary voyage, Font was both an imaginary figure and also an imaginary voyage, but he propagated the notion that had great longevity that through a series of inlets, rivers, bays, it was possible to actually travel through North America in the high latitudes, about 60 to 70 degrees north. That feature is also detectable in this image. Now, this was not, although Cook would sail in search of the Northwest Passage in 1778, and I'll show you the result of that here in our next map. There were intervening images in the wake of this one by Voyage and Euler that were more accurate depictions and incorporated the findings of Bering and other Russian navigators by Gerhard Muller in 1754, whose principal contribution was the definition of the Alaskan subcontinent, which you can't really see at all in this image before you. And then in 1774, by Jacob von Stalen, which provided, although it was very much garbled, at least gave a hint of the Aleutian chain of islands, which is also very sketchily depicted here. So my point is there were evolutions of cartographic comprehension between this point in time, the early 1750s and 1778, when Cook sailed here. But I want you to remember this image because versions of the key features on the North American side, the Mer de l'Ouest and Admiral Font's network of inlets, lakes, and streams would be resurrected in subsequent versions of the Northwest Passage. Let's now go to map number 2. Now the image here is the master map of Cook's track for all 3 voyages, published in 1784. It was as a part of the atlas to the account of his 3rd voyage of exploration, the one that was in search of the Northwest Passage. Just quickly, Cook's first voyage was to the South Pacific to observe the transit of Venus, a rare astronomical phenomenon. The second voyage was a quest for Terra Australis Incognita, which by crisscrossing the Indian, Pacific, and Atlantic Oceans, he proved did not exist, although he gained a hint, the first, I might add, that there was a southern polar continent. Then the third voyage in search of the Northwest Passage. The map is a full projection, Mercator-like projection, running from 70 degrees south to 70 degrees or more north. I consider this to be the first modern map of the world, published in 1784. Why the first modern map? Note its rigorous commitment to the grid of latitude and longitude. Again, I mentioned earlier the quest for longitude and the almost checkerboard pattern of the map allowed the first accurate projection of the major continental outlines. More particularly, the map accurately depicts the separation or the span of the oceanic distances. One of the things that, in Columbus's time, he thought it was a rather short sail across the Atlantic to China and the East Indies. Cook was the first one, once he even allows for the interposing effect of North and South America, Cook was the first one to show just how vast a distance across the Pacific such a sail was. So, rigorous commitment to the grid of latitude and longitude, first accurate depiction of continental outlines. Anyone looking at this map today would say, yeah, that looks like South America over there on the left. That looks like Africa. That looks like Australia. North America is properly proportioned. Europe and Eurasia too. And it also showed in relation to North America, for the first time, the actual projection of the trend line of the northwest coast of North America, which of course will become central to the question of a Northwest Passage, especially if one is going to approach it from the northwest side. Among many earlier projections of North American cartography were many that abutted the location of the modern Oregon-California border at about 42 degrees north latitude. That the North America's coastline, Pacific coastline, bent very generally to the northeast conveniently. This is the geography of hope, minimizing the distance from one ocean to the other. Cook, like he vanquished Terra Australis Incognita, also vanquished the idea of a convenient northeasterly trend line of North America, such as you saw on Euler's map that we saw earlier. Now, I want to call particular attention to some sub-features on this map that may be more difficult to discern than the span of the Pacific Ocean or the generally accurate depiction of South America or Africa. Because Cook was the first to accurately depict the subcontinental dimensions of Alaska, you'll see a hint of an inlet, what we know today as Cook Inlet, the site of the modern-day city of Anchorage, which Cook misinterpreted as the outfall of a river. He thought it was a river. It was named Cook's River, was later named Cook Inlet by George Vancouver. To the right of Cook Inlet, running up to the left of Hudson Bay toward the Arctic, you can see a route of rivers and lakes which reaches about 70 degrees north. This is the route that Samuel Hearne took in the early 1770s from a fur trading post on Hudson Bay by Churchill, Manitoba, looking at a terrestrial quest in search of the Northwest Passage, anticipating in a way the kind of terrestrial quest for the same object that Alexander Mackenzie and Lewis and Clark would conduct. The upshot of Hearne's voyage, going far to the west and north of Hudson Bay, reaching 70 degrees north, suggested that there was no mid-latitude transit from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean in those latitudes, because if there were, he would have walked right over the top of it. So Hearne's findings, which were brought to Cook's attention prior to his third voyage, he left in July 1776, guided Cook's direction, which was, don't bother looking for a Northwest Passage in the 40s or 50s or even 60s of latitude, because this Hearne fellow has actually followed the Coppermine River to what was perceived to be 70 degrees north. So there's clearly no Northwest Passage in those latitudes. It must be higher than that. Thus, Cook's directions provided to him by the Admiralty, which is don't even begin to look for a Northwest Passage on the west coast of North America until you get to 65 degrees north. The problem in terms of the quest for the Northwest Passage is that when Cook got to 70 degrees north, off the northwest tip of Alaska, depicted here in this map, he ran into the same solid pack of ice that Baffin, Hudson, Frobisher, and all the navigators from England who were searching on the Atlantic side of the continent hit. And so there didn't appear to be a Northwest Passage in the high northern latitudes. But because he wasn't looking for the Northwest Passage in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, as you see in this map, the west coast of North America is rather straight. It's it's not quite a straight edge, but it's very gently arranged with very little complication or complexity associated with it. Of course, anyone who's familiar with the northwest coast of North America from the Strait of Juan de Fuca northward knows that indeed the northwest coast is a very complex coastline, almost labyrinthine in its form, with an innumerable number of inlets, openings, and river streams that flow into it. This was discovered in Cook's wake by a host of maritime fur traders, the most famous of whom were John Meares and Robert Gray. Meares, an Englishman; Gray, an American. Gray, who crossed the bar of the Columbia River in 1792. So the maritime fur traders found a far more intricate coastline of the northwest shore of North America than Cook depicted. There were, as I said, numerous inlets and openings, the biggest and most important of which was the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which was imagined once again, as depicted in the Bouache and Euler image, as leading to a revised concept of the Mer de l'Ouest. In other words, whereas Hearn and Cook seem to have combined to have demolished the idea of a Northwest Passage in the mid-latitudes, 40s, 50s, and 60s, the intricate coastline detected by the maritime fur traders seemed to suggest, in a recurrence of the geography of hope, that there was this vast inland sea that didn't directly connect to Hudson Bay or Baffin Bay and Atlantic waters, but narrowed the terrestrial gap between them such that one could go well inland to the west by Hudson Bay off of the Atlantic, or well east off of the new Mediterranean, the old concept of the Mer de l'Ouest. And so this was conceived as the second version of the Northwest Passage, not a direct navigable route from east to west or west to east that Hudson or Drake or Cook were looking for, but a shortcut to a bridge of land somewhere in the middle of the continent that provided a short portage from Hudson Bay to this new western sea, as you saw in the very first map. And that led then to the context leading to the creation of the third map that we'll proceed to next. This map was published in 1798 in the Atlas to George Vancouver's exploration of the northwest coast of America. Vancouver had sailed with Cook on his second and third voyages, so he had been to this part of the world once before. There's a common misunderstanding among historians of the Pacific Northwest and the Northwest Coast, that Vancouver was sent here in the 1790s to make up for or to discern the geographic features that Captain Cook had somehow missed in 1778, such as the Columbia River that Robert Gray discerned, or the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which the maritime fur traders, as it were, rediscovered in the 1780s and early 1790s. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of Vancouver's mission. In fact, as I pointed out, Cook couldn't have missed what he wasn't sent to find, because, as I pointed out, he was directed to 65 north. It was presumed there was nothing in the mid-latitudes that was discoverable, that was relevant to his mission, which was the Northwest Passage. The idea gets regenerated by the maritime fur traders, primarily John Meares, and other speculative geographers, such as Alexander Dalrymple. And so trying to find some answer, trying to make sense of Cook's voyage and what the maritime fur traders had discovered, that mission fell to George Vancouver. But it wasn't Vancouver's primary mission. Vancouver's principal role was diplomatic. I don't have time to go into it today, but Mears had gotten into a fracas up at Nootka Sound on Vancouver Island. The Spanish expropriated some of his property. This created a sensation, almost brought Spain and Great Britain to the brink of war. Spain capitulated in terms of a treaty in 1790, one feature of which was that Mears's property at Nootka Sound was to be returned to British hands, and Vancouver was sent to Vancouver Island to receive that property back. But since he was going that far, a discovery agenda was added to his mission, which is basically, to put it in kind of colloquial terms, can you make sense between what Cook found and what the maritime fur traders are reporting? And so as a result of his 3-year exploration of the Northwest Coast, 1792, 1793, and 94, in 1798, Vancouver published his account, which included, among many maps, the one you see here. Now, Vancouver's scope wasn't as extensive. It was more extensive than Cook's and less in some other respects. Basically, he was charged with hitting the North American continent at the 42nd parallel, again, the modern boundary of Oregon and California, and essentially sail north, keeping the continent on his right, so that if there were any openings to the east, like the Mer de l'Ouest concept that Mears had repopularized, or an actual Northwest Passage, that Vancouver would find it. And of course, he didn't, because the second version of the Northwest Passage that Mears and Dalrymple popularized, the one, as I say, the maritime fur traders regenerated, that doesn't exist any more than the passage that Cook sought in 1778. This map, though, Vancouver's map provided a lot of comprehensive understanding about the Northwest Coast. For example, it was the first intimation, more than an intimation, it was the first projection, and some of the key place names in Northwest geography were the result of Vancouver's voyage. Admiralty Inlet, Puget Sound. Puget was a lieutenant sailing under Vancouver. The major mountains, Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens, Mount Hood, those place names all derived from Vancouver's charting and those of his adjutants. Vancouver explored what we know of as Admiralty Inlet, Puget Sound, circumnavigated Vancouver Island, proved that Vancouver Island was in fact insular in nature. When Cook visited Nootka Sound, he presumed it was just simply a part of the continental mainland. This was part of the complexity of the Northwest Coast that Cook didn't bother with because he didn't need to bother with, but which later fur traders and explorers like Vancouver discerned. But before moving off of this map and moving to the third projection of the Northwest Passage, I want to call your attention to the inset map that was included of the lower Columbia River. Now, this was a map that Meriwether Lewis, in anticipation of his transcontinental voyage, copied in Philadelphia, which he saw that, again, Vancouver's account and map had been published in 1798. In 1802 and 3, Meriwether Lewis studied this and in fact made a copy of this as later recorded in the journals. This inset map, combined with the hasty nature of Lewis's copy of this map, had the effect in some of destroying William Clark's reputation as a geographer, because it was a very naive depiction of the mouth of the Columbia River, in particular, the prominence of Point Ellis, which, for those of you viewing from North America, is the point at the mouth of the Columbia River, where the bridge from Astoria lands on the north, which is on the south bank, where it lands on the north bank. That's Point Ellis on the north bank. Lieutenant Broughton, who actually did the survey of the Columbia River in 1792 as a part of Vancouver's 3-year voyage of the Northwest Coast, did not do a particularly good job in depicting the prominence of Point Ellis. And so that when Lewis and Clark, just to jump ahead of the story a little bit, when Lewis and Clark are coming down the Columbia River in the fall of 1805, William Clark, to some people, infamously declares ocean in view, because to the right, he is seeing land beyond which there is no ocean, and he thinks that's Cape Disappointment. But in fact, it was Point Ellis. And so I talk a lot about this in my book, which are books, both River of Promise and Lewis and Clark Reframed. So I give a full elaboration of the argument. But I just wanted to highlight here that the naive depiction of Broughton and Vancouver in this inset map did much to damage William Clark's reputation as a geographer, because students of the Lewis and Clark expedition for the last century have accused of Clark of getting ahead of himself a little bit and not really seeing the Pacific Ocean when he said the ocean was in view. But what misled him was the faulty nature of this inset map. Let's now move to map 4. This map was published in 1801 and was incorporated in Alexander Mackenzie's account of travels in a volume entitled Voyages from Montreal. The book actually has a much longer title than that, but that's the way it's commonly referred to. Now, Mackenzie was a fur trader for the Northwest Company, which was a competitor of the Hudson Bay Company. They later merged in the 1820s, which is another famous story in Northwest history. But at the time, the Northwest Company, operating out of Montreal, thus the title of the book, the company competed with the Hudson Bay Company by encircling Hudson Bay, which we've seen in earlier maps, and you can see here. The thought being, since the Hudson Bay Company would get its furs in and out of Hudson Bay, the merchants operating out of Montreal explored the lakes and rivers to the west of Hudson Bay, and in a sense encircled the Hudson Bay Company, and in the process discovered the very intricate nature of northern Canadian geography, what's now the northern aspect of provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, the Northwest Territories, etc. One of these fur traders was a figure named Peter Pond, who was actually an American, but working for the Northwest Company out of British Canada in Montreal. Now, he was just moving west, always the fur trader was always looking for new country. They would trap out the beaver. They just go over the next ridgeline into the next river basin, looking to keep the supply going. Along the way, Pond got wind of the notion of Cook's River, which I highlighted in an earlier map, which Cook had suggested had its headwaters deep into the North American continental interior. Again, to repeat, this was an error on Cook's part. He was an oceanic man, not a river man. Cook Inlet has some minor streams that flow into it, but in fact, that does not drain extensively into the North American interior. But Cook had and other people who had traveled with Cook, including John Ledyard, had popularized the notion that there was this large river draining the North American interior that flowed into the ocean at about Pacific Ocean at about 60 degrees north. So Pond sets on a mission to try to find these headwaters, figuring that he can thereby link Montreal on the Atlantic through the chain of lakes and rivers through North America to Cook's River that reaches out onto the Pacific Ocean. This is the seed point of the third version of the Northwest Passage. To recapitulate, the saltwater navigable passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific, or the Pacific to the Atlantic, that Drake and Hudson and Cook looked for. That was version 1. Version 2, the notion of an inland communication, the mer de l'Ouest, the idea that Mears and Dalrymple popularized, this vast extension of the Pacific saltwater deep into the North American continent. Vancouver demolished that. There's an inland sea. We know it as the Salish Sea, Puget Sound, the Georgian Strait, the waters adjoining Vancouver Island on the Inside Passage, but is nowhere near the mer de l'Ouest. So Pond, with his assistant and successor, Alexander Mackenzie, begin to popularize the notion of a Northwest Passage in the form of rivers, lakes, and an outlet on the Pacific Ocean, which again, you'll recall, there was an early hint of in the purely fantastical notion of the mythical voyage of Admiral Dufont, which Cook thought he had demolished, Vancouver thought he had demolished, and they had, but now the idea comes back again with this idea of a series of lakes and rivers achieving, in effect, with a series of freshwater passages, what the saltwater route that both Cook and Vancouver couldn't find. So it was a replacement for them. So this was the third generation of the Northwest Passage. And what you see in this map is a depiction of Mackenzie's track. Again, Pond left the trade. Mackenzie was his successor, took up the idea of finding the headwaters of Cook's River. In 1789, he got on wide, strong flowing streams, ultimately, which took him to the Arctic Ocean, which you see at the north of this map. That stream is known as the ultimate combined stream is the Mackenzie River. It's known as the Mackenzie Basin. It led north into the Arctic Ocean, not west into the Pacific. So 4 years later, Mackenzie tries again, finds another stream, one that is now trending more southerly. He's still hoping it will be the headwaters of Cook's River, but this stream takes him to the Pacific Ocean in the on the northwest coast of North America in the mid-50s. It's the modern-day central British Columbia coastline. It's not Cook's River either, but Mackenzie does seem, by discovering what he thinks is the Columbia River. Actually, he was on the Fraser, the headwaters of the Fraser. Mackenzie thinks, when he's writing in 1801, that he has found and established not maybe the Northwest Passage the Pond envisioned coming out at Cook's River, but he's perhaps come up with a workable alternative farther south by traveling up the Saskatchewan or the great inland lakes of the Canadian interior, crossing over the Continental Divide to what, again, he thinks is the Columbia River, which had been discovered in the meantime by Robert Gray. He was actually on the Fraser River, which comes out near modern-day Vancouver. When Mackenzie publishes this map in 1801, that is the contemporary state of geographic information. At the time, Lewis and Clark commenced their voyage west in 1803. Or put another way, Lewis and Clark are tasked by President Jefferson to find a more southerly version of the mid-latitude northern version of a system of lakes and rivers that Mackenzie seemed to have discovered. There was a pregnant few paragraphs near the end of Mackenzie's account where he talks about the companies or the nations that can dominate this network up the St. Lawrence, through the Great Lakes, to the northern Canadian lakes, Lake Athabasca, Great Slave Lake, the upper reach of the Columbia River. Any company or nation that can dominate that fur trade will dominate the entirety of North America. And as those paragraphs, when Thomas Jefferson reads Mackenzie's account in 1802, that launches what we know as the Lewis and Clark expedition. Basically, Jefferson concluded, Mackenzie has written this great strategic vision for British imperial interests. I need to get my team out in the field so we can thwart and prevent the encirclement of the nascent United States and get our own pathway to the Pacific Ocean. Now, we don't have the time today to do a full recapitulation of the Lewis and Clark voyage, other than to say that on his return to St. Louis in 1806, Meriwether Lewis, not wanting to disappoint his patron, writes a letter to Jefferson basically saying he has discovered this Northwest Passage that will serve as the means of conveying goods and people from waters flowing into the Atlantic to waters that flow into the Pacific. But again, it's the same geography of hope that was impelling Drake and Cook and Mears and Pond and Mackenzie. Lewis gets caught up in the same psychology. The idea of the Northwest Passage is such a fixed idea that even when it doesn't exist, people compose in their imagination the practicability of such a route. But as we know, the system, as either Mackenzie envisioned it or as certainly as Lewis envisioned it, is not the practicable Northwest Passage that speculators and statesmen, cartographic speculators and commercial speculators and statesmen such as Thomas Jefferson imagined. The Northwest Passage was kind of relegated to the dustbin of history in the wake of Lewis and Clark. So that's the story of the Northwest Passage in 4 maps. There are many more. They can be found in mine and other books. But let me just offer a few concluding comments, and then we can go to question and answer. First major point would be this: since nature refused to cooperate, that is, since there wasn't a practicable Northwest Passage that could be discovered, one was built. And it was built in the form of a technology that we know today, 19th century technology, still very much dominant today. The transcontinental railroad systems, initially in the form of the Northern Pacific Railway or north of the 49th parallel, the Canadian Pacific Railway, and since an iron and steam engine version of the Northwest Passage was constructed in the 1880s in the form of these transcontinental rail lines. Now, the Arctic had somewhat of a resurgence of interest after Cook. In the post-Napoleonic era, where many of the captains in the British Navy had nothing to do, many of them were on half pay, the British reverted to the idea of looking for the Northwest Passage where Cook first looked for it. That is to say, in the high northern latitudes. And the central figure in this saga, which we don't have time to go into today, was Sir John Franklin, who in the 1820s and then again in the 1840s, like Cook, actually conducted 3 voyages looking for the Northwest Passage in the northern Canadian archipelago. He took 2 of these trips overland. One actually followed the track of Samuel Hearne, who I talked about in an earlier sense, following the Coppermine River to the shore of the Arctic. He led a subsequent overland expedition down to the Mackenzie River and mapped much of the Arctic coastline, running from Prudhoe Bay through to the central Arctic. No one had quite sailed through the Northwest Passage, however, although the Arctic coastline was slowly being mapped over the course of the 1830s and 40s. Franklin did try to sail through in 1845, but his ships famously or infamously got stuck in the ice. He died on his 3rd voyage, much like Cook did, the difference being that everyone died on Franklin's 3rd voyage, and most of those who sailed with Cook got back to Great Britain in 1780. So in the wake of Franklin's loss, dozens of other expeditions were sent out searching for Franklin, and that led to the final delineation of the icebound passages, saltwater passages in the northern Canadian archipelago. But here's the point I would wish to end with. And Roald Amundsen, that ineffable explorer, clearly in Cook's class, first man to reach the South Pole, first man to actually transit the Northwest Passage, and although having to overwinter a couple of times, first made that transit in 1906. The Northwest Passage, ironically, given the pace of global warming, climate change, the Northwest Passage is slowly coming back or coming into existence, in the sense that with the recession of the northern ice packs, it's increasingly possible to sail through the Canadian archipelago seasonally in the manner originally envisioned by Cook's 3rd voyage. And it's conceivable, with the pace of global warming, that within a century or so, that much of that Northwest Passage might be transited by boat, again in the sense that was originally envisioned by Cook's final voyage. So that would be the 5th version of the Northwest Passage, but in a way, the first version, the classic version of the Northwest Passage that enveloped Cook's career. So I've hoped today to give some cartographic highlights to this long-lasting quest, a story that is still not completed. If there's any additional follow-up desired in mine and other books, my Lewis and Clark Reframed or Captain Cook Rediscovered, all of the maps you saw today are visible in those books and in others. And so with that, I will call to a halt and see if there are any questions that might be asked.
Thank you, Dave, for sharing about these 4 maps and the Northwest Passage. Thank everyone for joining us today. Please mark your calendars for our next In Their Footsteps in a similar format on Sunday, November 21st, when John Drury shares about another captain, Captain George Flavelle. If you follow Lewis and Clark National Historical Park on Facebook, notification of these virtual events will show up on your newsfeed. Thank you for joining us today. We'll keep the chat open for a few more minutes. Thank you.